Herle Burlyites, welcome to the pod. And right off the top today, I want to thank Low Road Acres for orienteering their way through the hills and valleys of the Apple Podcasts rate and review system and leaving us this beautiful boot print. As a recovering political addict, the weekly appointment I have with the Herle Burly is can't miss listening. As someone who's both run for public office and helped others do the same, it's great to listen to both the regular panel and the guests. I'm always challenged, thoughts are provoked, and I'm entertained each week. The panel puts the cussed in disgust. Thank you, Low Road Acres. Cussed in disgust. We're stealing that bright, shiny gem from you. All right, we got our customary two-part pod for you today. Part one is Camille Quenneville and Dr. David Goldbloom, and we're going to have a discussion on mental health, politics, policy, and care. Besides being a lifelong friend of mine, Camille is CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division, a post she's held since 2012. Dr. Goldbloom is a psychiatrist, senior medical advisor at CAMH, and a director of their foundation board. We're going to talk about the role of mental health in our political system. What do mental health advocates think we need to do differently about Medicare? Why aren't we treating mental health the same we would as a broken leg from a funding perspective? I also want to talk about mental health issues more broadly. How do we know when to seek help for anxiety or depression if we haven't been clinically diagnosed? How do we find our way into the system? Part two today is our political panel with Jenni, Byrne, Scott, Reid, and me, bringing you all the political news of the last week with some laughs. And if Scott, Jenni, and I are on our game, some particularly creative swearing and animal references. Lots to discuss and cuss about this week. McKenna is walking away in the prime of her career and just weeks away from her pension. Why? Has being a cabinet minister become that unappealing a job? Carolyn Bennett's having the roughest week of her political career and is probably still looking for the unsend button on her computer. We'll dive into that. And forget August. It's smelling more and more like an election call in July. So what the hell is this election going to be about? How's the vote going to break? Will the Liberals have their majority before the Manitoba border? And of course, stick around for our Hey Yous. Camille, Dr. Goldbloom, welcome to the Herle Burly. So happy you're here with me today.
Great to be with you, and please call me David, even if it leads to some confusion among the two Davids on the pod.
Yeah, David, thanks for saying up front, lifelong friends first before my role in mental health. I appreciate that. I mean, that's generally how I introduce myself everywhere. David
As
Herle's
a lifelong friend of David Herle's.
Exactly.
Yeah. You'll find that opens a lot of doors for you.
Oh yeah, it's worked well. It's worked very well.
They mostly lead to back alleys, those doors, but nonetheless they open. I met Camille through her brother Carl Quenneville, one of the most elegant smokers I've ever met.
Been smoked in decades, for the record.
The most unique and meticulous hairstyle I've ever seen, one of the smartest guys I've ever known, and Carl and I saw every game of the 1985-86 Canadiens season, including their run to the Stanley Cup. So, I go back a fair way with the Quennevilles, back to the mid-'80s.
There you go.
So,
and
it
you
is
know
great
all
to
of
have
us.
you on. I do. Well, your parents were big organizers for Paul Martin.
My parents, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles. Yeah, it was very much a family affair, going back generations. Right.
Yeah. All right. So, I start off every one of my conversations since the pandemic started by asking people how they are. And since we're talking about mental health today, I will expect particularly acute answers from the two of you about yourselves. So, Camille, have you got your 2 shots? Are you out there patioing and partying? Has life turned around? How are you doing?
I've got 2 shots. I have not been out there patioing or partying, to be quite honest. My job is a little more than full-time. And I have had the chance actually to volunteer at some of the vaccination clinics over the weekend, which was delightful. I am, thank you for asking, David. I'm very well. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, you start to become very focused on what's really important here and what do we want to see at the end of the pandemic. And I, of course, wanted all of my family to be healthy And they are, fortunately, and they are all also double vaccinated, as are my friends. So feeling very blessed and very fortunate at this point.
You, David, how are you doing?
I actually, to my wife's great surprise, am doing okay, because she thought that I was the kind of person who needed to be in a different kind of Herle Burly, which is the Herle Burly of hospital life, where you're running into all kinds of colleagues and students and patients. And instead, I've been squirreled away in my bat cave, from which I'm broadcasting right now, for most of the last year and a half. Now, I'm lucky. I'm lucky in the sense that A, I have a bat cave. B, I can do so much of my job as a psychiatrist virtually. And in fact, I'd been doing a lot of virtual care to Northern Ontario for the last 20 years. So in fact, immediately after we record this, I will be in Elliott Lake for my usual gig, seeing patients for the family health team there. But another lucky factor for me was that because I work in a hospital environment, I got vaccinated early. So by February, I had my second dose. And you might think, great, there's your ticket to freedom. Except that as a health professional, I feel like I have to live to a pretty high standard of public behavior. And we know politicians who've fallen below that standard and paid the price. So I have
the odd hospital executive too. The odd hospital.
Yes, the odd hospital. No question. No question. Although they straddle medicine and politics, as you can imagine. So for me, we've been really devout about the pandemic restrictions, which is as frustrating for us as it is for anybody. But you know what? Like so many people, I've discovered things that I didn't know about either myself or the world around me as a consequence of the pandemic. So that's been kind of interesting.
Yeah. Don't you think we're all, though, kind of weird in ways we don't even understand, having gone through this? Like, how it must have affected all of us somehow.
Oh, I think
you're living in your bat cave. I moved up to the country for a year and a half.
It's changed all of us, but I think what you're going to be impressed by is our capacity to bounce back to our old selves pretty quickly. It's, I think, part of the resilience of the human spirit that you revert to old ways pretty easily, despite the upheaval and despite all the vows to live a different and better life after this experience. We'll probably mainly go back to our routines as soon as we have permission.
Hey, Camille.
And ideally with a little more gratitude.
Camille, I don't want to make this about the pandemic, because I don't want to give the impression that mental health is only an issue because of the pandemic. But what are the ways in which the pandemic has exacerbated the issue in Canada?
Well, interestingly, I think the issue of isolation is clearly the most significant. I think, quite truthfully, loneliness. We began to do some research on loneliness before the pandemic started, if you could imagine, and looking at the impact that has. And we contracted with a number of researchers across Canada and the United States. And interestingly, there's this gentleman at Duke University who is an expert in loneliness. And he told us very early on that it's not as you would think. So when I think of loneliness, I think of my 87-year-old mother, perhaps having dinner alone on occasion. In fact, there are many points in one person's life when they might feel lonely. And for us now, it's hard to imagine, because when you and I were in our late teens, early 20s, I don't think we thought about loneliness, but that age group now really has grown up on a screen. And whether it's their phone or an iPad or whatever, they have lost the ability to have the kinds of social connections that you and I took for granted. So when they have life changes and they go off to university or they're forced to live differently, they can have some loneliness. They're not used to having to make those in-person connections, social connections. The other time is in your middle 50s. And we've all experienced friends or family who have had marital breakdown, not you, David, who have had marital breakdown, who are finding themselves sending their children off to school or having for the first time an empty nest or potentially living alone. And loneliness creeps in. So we're actually doing a lot of research and building a community framework around how to tackle loneliness and bringing all the partners together that are on this journey with us. So immigrant and settlement organizations, seniors organizations, any organization that would support individuals. So what the pandemic has done is really shone a spotlight on these kinds of issues that we take for granted. It's also really helped us understand grief a lot better because we're all grieving. We've all lost in the last year and a half. Hopefully we haven't lost a loved one, but we've lost the life we used to know and the connections we had with friends and the ability to see family and the ability to participate in celebrations that bring us joy. So we've lost that and we're grieving that loss. So again, we think of grief as I've lost a loved one and I'm grieving, not in the context of I used to be able to do this and I haven't been able to do that for a year and a half, or I haven't been able to see that person. So how is that grief affecting me? And so these are areas that we've really launched and done a tremendous amount of work looking at and try to research in a way that we can make real and bring about some good public policy solutions around.
But I think we have to conceptualize the pandemic as simply an accelerant poured onto an already raging fire. This is not a de novo problem. And in fact, I was listening to the Surgeon General of the United States to emphasize the political element of this. Vivek Murthy, who's back in his second tour of duty as Surgeon General, was interviewed by David Axelrod last week. And he has actually written a book about loneliness as a Surgeon General and declaring it a really high health priority because it has so many physical health consequences, let alone mental health consequences. And I mean, Camille has done an important job of parsing the distinction between loneliness and isolation. Right? They're not the exact same thing. And the paradox is that people are feeling more lonely in a context of hyperconnectivity through social media, through iPads, all of that stuff. We have the potential to be more connected than ever before, and yet loneliness is higher. And in the UK, well before the pandemic, they established a ministry in the government to try to address the issue of loneliness because they saw the health implications, both mental and physical. So we need to do a way better job of overcoming loneliness, quite apart from the other raft of mental health problems and mental illnesses whose suffering has been compounded by the pandemic. People who can't access services the way they used to, that help them stave off the worst elements of a chronic mental illness. They are being cut off from the resources that they need.
And to drive that point home, I think it's so well made, David. We did some public opinion polling throughout the pandemic to really try to gauge how folks were really doing. And we learned that in April of 2020, that 54% of Ontarians, and this frankly matches very much national numbers, so I'm confident around it having a nationwide impact as well. 54% of Ontarians said they had very good mental health. Move forward across two other polls, the most recent being in March of this year, again, before the real impact of the third wave, and that number is now 35%. So it's not all about the pandemic, but to David Goldbloom's point, that is exactly heightening where we see how Ontarians are doing, how Canadians are doing. And I'm going to shamelessly plug David Goldbloom's new book, We Can Do Better. It is an excellent read, and I think it so beautifully outlines where we are in mental health in Canada, and he does it in such a personal way by talking about the journey of various people with various diagnoses. And I would encourage folks to buy that and take a read and educate yourself about the mental health of all Canadians.
Yeah, I read the book before the hockey game last night. It helped me prepare mentally, helped me manage my way through the game. There, I was looking for apps. By the third period, I was looking for apps that could talk to me.
Listen, I'm the only.
I want to start by putting us. Yeah.
I'm the only Florida Panthers fan in Toronto, so I know lonely. I know lonely.
That's family, though. That's a family connection. You didn't choose that voluntarily. You are a legitimate Habs fan who has a family connection to the Florida Panthers.
Okay, I'll explain it to Joel that way. That's fair. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, exactly. If you're a regular listener to the pod, you know I've made a heavy emotional investment in Les Habitants de Montréal. I have a number of different jerseys. Mysterious cosmic voices tell me which one to wear for each game. And when I add my lucky Guy Lafleur socks, well, I emit a powerful karmic Canadians energy force. Don't judge me, it's working. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, has been investing heavily too. Over $240 billion to improve digital connectivity across the country since the year 2000, with an additional $54 billion investment through the end of 2024. $13 billion of that is going to British Columbia. Post-COVID, it'll create about 12,000 jobs in construction, engineering, and emerging technologies. But let me tell you a story of how that kind of investment impacts lives. Later this year, the town of Gold River will be among 187 additional communities to join the TELUS 5G network. Brad Unger is the mayor there. He knows exactly how critical reliable connectivity is. In 2013, Brad slipped outside his vehicle on a mountainous stretch of highway near Gold River. Bleeding badly from 3 crushed temporal arteries, he couldn't call for help because there was no cell service to the area. Luckily, another car was right behind him. Next thing you know, Brad's at the hospital with 120 fresh stitches to the side of his head. Since that day, Brad's been working with TELUS to bring and constantly improve digital connectivity to the region. Never more important since the onset of the pandemic for health, safety, and education. And blazing fast 5G is just going to bring more residents to the area who want to change of pace from the life in the big city. You can learn more about all of this at telus.com/connectingcanada. Okay, so just to put some parameters around this discussion, when we talk about mental health, like you just said that the percentage of people feeling that their mental health is good went from 55 in Ontario to 35% at the end of the pandemic. Are those all people that need treatment, or are they just having a bad day? Like, what is the amount of undiagnosed mental health problems in Canada that should be treated clinically?
So look, we know that based on very good survey data, that about 1 in 5 Canadians every year, and not the same 1 in 5 Canadians every year, experiences some form of mental illness, mild, moderate, or severe. And at the same time, not every mental health problem, if you want to call it that, is a mental illness. So in other words, when you see reports of anxiety among Canadians that's, topping out at 30 or 40% of Canadians during the pandemic, does that mean that they all have a clinical disorder? No. And in fact, it becomes a risk of diluting the words into a kind of meaninglessness, because it would be a little weird not to be feeling anxious in the context of a global threat to humanity, right? Anybody who says, no, I'm just feeling great, I haven't even noticed the pandemic, to be honest, that would make you a little more worried about that person. So there is a subset of people, and part of the confusion here comes from the fact that when we talk about mental illnesses, we're talking about extremes of what are normal human experiences. So sadness, worry, fear, those are all joy, those are all normal human experiences. But when they mutate into depression, mania, paranoia, or severe anxiety, then they become quite disabling. And it's the disabling part. It's the interference with people's ability to function, their quality of life. That's what helps us to set the goalposts around when normal human experience and the range of normal human experience becomes a problem that requires an intervention. And, my basic rule of medicine is very complicated. It is that you shouldn't scratch where it doesn't itch. But trust me, when people develop mental illnesses, it gets pretty itchy and people need help. And the reality in Canada is that there is A, not enough help to go around, B, confusion about when and how to seek help. And if we were to translate that into the experience of physical illnesses, people would be jumping up and down and screaming. But because of the stigma, shame, and silence that continues to dog the experience of people with mental illness, there is a little less noise. That being said, I have enough white hair at this point to recall a time when mental illness was not on the agenda of any political party. Right now, Camille was a child at the time, but I was already working as a psychiatrist, and you could not get on the radar politically. Now it's very different. It's a nonpartisan issue. We've had the most conservative government federally in recent memory create the Mental Health Commission under Stephen Harper. And every party from the Greens to Maxime Bernier will endorse the importance of mental health and the need to emphasize it. However, there's still a gap between the rhetoric and the action.
I would say there's a huge gap.
I'm sure that when Maxime Bernier becomes Prime Minister, mental health is going to be a major priority. So it's good that you've got that lined up. But
we're not going to wait for that day, David, to continue to press our case. And I have to tell you that David Goldbloom has hit the nail on the head. I talk to politicians all day, every day, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that they are very, very committed to the cause of mental health. And it is sincere. And I can tell you that there is no other issue like mental health been in politics a long time. There really isn't, where there is genuine agreement. What we haven't seen is enough movement on the file. And that's not a political statement around the government in Ontario or the government in Ottawa at the moment. It is just a collective need to really decide they're going to do more and focus on this issue. 500,000 Canadians a week don't go to work because they're struggling with their mental health. This is 2.8% of our gross domestic product we lose every year because people are struggling with their mental health. I don't think there's a CEO in the country that, if they really focused on this and understood the impact, would say, I'm quite prepared to let that productivity go in my organization simply by not addressing the mental health of my workforce. So this takes a concerted effort across political lines, across business lines, labor, et cetera. And I think we're at the forefront of that, but we need a lot more.
And just to follow on.
Wait, Dr. Gold. Wait, David.
Okay.
You guys, I wasn't going to talk about politics this early in the conversation. I was going to talk more about mental health, but you guys drove me straight to politics. And Camille, you can't come on my show and bullshit me. So here we go. November 9th, 2020, Canada Newswire. Ontario's leading mental health organizations, including Addictions and Mental Health Ontario, Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, Children's Mental Health Ontario, the Royal Ontario Shores Centre for Mental Health Services, and Waypoint Centre for Mental Health Care, are disappointed that the Ontario government has failed to recognize the mental health and addiction crisis in Ontario for the 2020 budget. Just over a week ago, Premier Doug Ford told reporters that the mental health of Ontarians is his government's number one priority. The comment was a reminder of the commitment to create a comprehensive and connected system for mental health and addiction and to invest $3.8 billion over 10 years. But the 2020 budget included no new announcements for additional mental health and addiction services, and we are concerned the government is not taking this parallel pandemic seriously. So that doesn't sound as cheery as what you were just telling me about governments.
So what I said is I believe I said they're personally committed. So no, don't laugh at me, David Herle. What I could tell you is when I talk to these politicians, as I do every single day, I know that they are personally committed. That's true of Mike Schreiner in the Green Party. It's true of Andrea Horwath. It's true of all of the leaders. They are personally committed. What we are not seeing, as I said, is the action that matches that commitment. And I think what you just read is very reflective of that. And frankly, I've been in this game for a real long time. And no government has stepped up and said, we're going to let our rhetoric match our action here on this file. So we just have a really long way to go.
And let me follow up just with what Camille was talking about in terms of the statistics, the financial impact, the people away from their jobs, all of that stuff. I heard somebody describe statistics as numbers with the tears washed away. And, when I talk to the public about mental illness, inevitably I start by asking the audience, how many of you in the course of your growing up, your family, your neighborhood, your school, your job, know of somebody who you cared about who struggled with a mental illness? And inevitably, and I'll be speaking sometimes to a group of 1,000 people, every hand goes up. And then I ask them, in that same context of growing up, working, going to school, how many of you know somebody who died by suicide? And again, every hand goes up. And the point of that exercise is to shift people away from the kind of traditional Canadian expectation of, well, what is the government going to do? Towards the, what are you going to do? What are you going to do for the people in your immediate orbit? What are you going to do when you go to the ballot box, when you speak to your member of provincial or federal parliament? How is your voice going to be heard? And how are your actions going to reflect the impact of the experience that you've had? Because at least so far in my 67 years on the planet, it's affected everybody.
I wonder, David, how Canadians would feel if they knew that we're not keeping up with other G8 countries on spending on mental health.
Right. And, in Canada, when the Mental Health Commission was created back in 2007, and I had the privilege of serving on the board of the commission, we put out a plan, a strategy for Canada for mental health, where we modestly, in a typical Canadian way, said, let's see the percentage of health spending that goes to mental health. which is currently at about 6 to 7% of all health spending.
7.2 for the record.
What I meant to say was exactly 7.2. That's rounded up from 7.19%. Thank you, Camille.
It's my job to keep you honest at all times, Dr.
That's
Goldbloom.
a full-time job.
It is
anyway,
a full-time job.
7.2% of all health spending going to mental health. We called for an increase to 9% over 10 years. So a pretty gradual increase. And by the way, that would simply make us less inferior to other countries where spending on mental health is 11 to 13% of health dollars.
Yeah.
And it's also, if you look at the burden of mental illness financially, but also personally, it outstrips other disorders. We have data from here in Ontario, from the Public Health Agency, that looked at just 7 mental illnesses and compared them with cancers and infectious diseases in Ontario, adults aged 15 to 64. And they looked at the impact in terms of years lost due to premature death and years lived with a disability. And they found that those 7 mental illnesses outstripped all cancers combined in Ontario in terms of impact of disease, burden of disease. It was, I think, 7 times greater, this is pre-pandemic, than all infectious diseases combined. And depression alone was greater a burden on Ontarians than breast, lung, colon, and prostate cancer.
Okay, I really have a question about this I need to ask you, and it's because I'm trying to get my hands around who we're talking about. And just excuse my stupidity as a layperson. Feels to me like there are obvious cases of mental illness out there, people who've ended up on the streets and are homeless, people who have opioid addictions. These are some fairly obvious cases. But, when you're talking about depression, and your book, David, talked a lot about self-referral and ease of getting into the system. But if you are a person who's dealing with depression or anxiety on a day-to-day basis, and I mean, I presume that the incidence of antidepressants in Canada is pretty large.
Yes.
Being prescribed.
Yes.
So there's a lot of people that are doing this. How do you know when it's not normal? Like, how do you know when you're outside the normal human condition? I think most people, I'll speak for myself, try to deal with these things internally and manage them, and don't see it as something that requires external intervention in a different way than I see my leg if I broke it. I don't expect to manage my broken leg, but I do expect to manage my own mind.
So let me take that in terms of depression. One of the challenges is the word depression itself, which gets diluted into meaninglessness. You might be saying to yourself this morning, I'm so depressed by the outcome of last night's hockey game. And so that in that sense, you're using the word depressed as a kind of glorified version of sad or pissed off. And the reality is when depression hits, it's a qualitatively different experience. I ask every patient with depression, what's the difference for you between feeling sad and feeling depressed? And you know what, David? They can answer in a heartbeat. They said, I know when I'm sad, I know what's making me feel this way. I know the feeling is going to go away. When I'm depressed, it's a kind of numbness. I just feel flat. And then depression, when it's an illness, includes a whole host of accompanying symptoms, fundamental disturbances in sleep, energy, motivation, concentration, appetite, sexual drive. And accompanying that as it progresses is almost inevitably the thought of, well, if I'm feeling this bad, if I'm feeling this useless, if I don't see a future for myself, Why should I stick around? And that's a pretty common thought. And for some people, mercifully a minority of people with depression, that can actually progress into thinking, how should I get rid of myself? How should I kill myself? And for an even smaller group, that progresses to trying to kill themselves. So it's a very different experience. But look, if you have a headache, all of us get headaches from time to time. How do you decide if it's a headache that's worth doing something about? Well, if you take a couple of aspirins or Advils and it goes away, you're probably going to stop thinking about it. If it's persistent, if it starts to erode how you're feeling and functioning, you're going to say, what the hell is this? And what are you going to do? You're not going to call a neurosurgeon. You're not going to say, this could be a brain tumor. Could I see a neurosurgeon? No, you're probably going to go to your family doctor as the first port of call to see, is this something I should be worried about? You know, there's this irony that we think we have to know what's wrong before we ask for help. The time to ask for help is when you don't know what's wrong and you go to somebody who might be able to help you figure that out and then figure out next steps from there.
Okay. Camille, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I often marvel at how Dr. Goldbloom is able to take complex issues and really break them down. I would just say that the work that we do, picking up where he left off about the visits of the family doctor, we work really hard to try to make connections from family doctors to community-based care and ensure that people who are on the mild to moderate end of the spectrum receive the kind of help that they need in their community, and that they continue to go on to lead healthy, productive lives. And it may be a single occurrence. It may be the kind of thing that we have a longer term relationship with them. But you know, the family doctor, I would be remiss if I didn't say that that's not always, family doctors tell me this, so I'm not, and I should say primary care providers generally tell me this, so I'm not telling tales out of school to say that they often feel ill-equipped when it comes to managing people who come through their doors and say, I'm struggling with my mental health. So when we talk about where the system needs support and attention, it's in many places, and sometimes that front door is one of them.
And I just
are we over medicating ourselves?
Sorry,
what's that?
Are we over medicating ourselves? Yeah, I was just riffing off your GP. The GP is the entry point. The GP's instinct is to prescribe something, right? So my question is, are we over medicating ourselves?
I think we are probably simultaneously over-medicating and under-medicating, in the sense that there are some people, you're right, for whom the quick 5-minute solution is to give that person a prescription and move on to the next person. And I don't want to tar people with a single brush, right? Because I happen to work with a number of primary care providers, nurse practitioners, and family doctors who do not do that, and who do create the time and space to listen and try to understand and explore non-pharmacological solutions as well as pharmacological ones. And then there's a whole other group of people who probably should be on medication and who are not. And they're not because they're not able to or haven't figured out how to access the care that they need. So it's a simultaneous problem of over-medication and under-medication. And I would also say that, one of the disturbing things about the pandemic is to see the increase in young people whose first point of contact with the mental health system is the emergency room. And that's been a growth in Canada and in the United States of young people seeking care. Why are they going there? Because they don't know about alternatives. They don't all need to be in the emergency room. And look, as somebody who's worked in emergency rooms, you see a certain tranche of people who don't need to be there. I remember as an intern, you'd pick up the chart at 3 a.m. on your shift, and the chief complaint on the chart was dizzy for 20 years. And you'd say, why are you coming to the emergency room with a complaint of dizziness for 20 years? And in part, it's because of the failure of the system to provide lower level intensity of care that's highly accessible.
So let me just riff off of that and tell you that in some places we are starting to get it right and we're moving in the right direction. So let me give you a 20-second commercial about Ontario's structured psychotherapy program. So it is designed to help people who are mild to moderate depression and anxiety. It is provided through a number of caregivers, including the 4 psychiatric hospitals in Ontario. But my organization happens to manage and run a program called Bounce Back, which is telephone-based coaching, very highly accessible for individuals who are struggling. And without getting into too much of the exact detail of how this all works, I can tell you that the provincial government has invested in it. It's intended to ensure there's a backstop for those people who are looking for that kind of help and support. It's a great referral mechanism for all primary care providers. And I think it's the start of building an infrastructure in the mental health system and addiction system that has long been lacking. And I, for one, am really quite enthusiastic about the possibilities around it. So you do need to give government credit when it's due. And I think this is a step in the right direction. And I'm pleased that Bounce Back is actually moving across the country as well.
And this is exactly, frankly, what needs to happen in Canada. So often when we have healthcare problems, our response is, well, we need more of the same. We need more psychiatrists, we need more psychologists. That is not going to be the solution, frankly. We will never generate the human resource in traditional categories to meet need. So you've got to do things that are innovative. The Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program riffs off the most massive change in mental health service delivery in England, which is the improving access to structured psychotherapy. And, this is a program now that in the UK, people directly can self-refer. They don't have to go through their family doctor. They can call a number. And it exists in every national health trust in the UK. And here's something that we don't have in Canada that they do have in the UK. They have outcomes on 98.5% of their visits. They can tell you how somebody did. And not only can they tell you, it's publicly available information. It's on a website anybody can access to see how did that service do? How did it perform? What are the wait times for access to those services? We have nothing like that in Canada. The government in England invested heavily in it, but the payback is improved functioning, improved quality of life, and decreased numbers of people on public assistance. And when you think about it that way, in the public sector, it mirrors what you see in the private sector, which is in the private sector, when companies invest in mental health, the return on investment is positive. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers.
What does a company investing in mental health mean, David? What does it mean for a company?
It means in the private sector, they have developed all kinds of programs for support, beefed up employee assistance, developed return to work strategies that are customized to mental health. We all know what to do when somebody comes back in a wheelchair with 2 broken legs. You build a ramp, you raise the desk, you do all those sorts of things. So when someone's brain has been broken, when somebody's mind is not working properly, how do you develop meaningful return to work to get that person back as quickly as possible? And we know from good Made in Canada evidence that when you invest in that way, your short-term disability costs tumble, and absenteeism from work also goes down. So for organizations, it's actually a really smart thing to invest in.
My question, and maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm just practical, but it feels to me like confidentiality is pretty critical to getting people to self-refer here and to seek help. Because if I was on a career track and I was in my 30s and 40s and I started to suffer from anxiety, the last thing I would do would be to tell my employer. The last thing I would do would be to tell my employer and have that on my record. I'm not going to be the CEO of that company. Once I tell them I've got anxiety issues, I'm never going to be the CEO of that company. I mean, that you can't help but have people look at you differently, question your aptitude, question how you would handle different circumstances. It's not like coming back from a broken leg or even coming back from cancer, because I don't really think people think you come back from this. It's something you have.
Right. And at the risk of incurring the wrath of Quenneville.
Because I'm so mean. Yeah.
I live in fear. David, you've really hit the nail on the head around culture change, right? And this is why it has been so important when leaders, whether they're in the world of sports, the world of entertainment, or the world of business, medicine, law, any domain you can think of, when people in positions of leadership express their own struggles and really serve as role models for opening the door about conversation and making people realize this is a common problem. It does not need to be something that dogs you forever or limits you. Then people are less afraid about seeking help. And, I've seen one of the major banks had a internal video. I don't know that it ever went external, but I saw it, of prominent people throughout the bank speaking nakedly about their experience with mental illness. And I'm not talking mild mental illness. I'm talking about people who got severely depressed and suicidal. I've seen the dean of a medical school in the United States write an article for the general public about when he went to a hotel and took an overdose and tried to kill himself. And the more these things become prominent, the more we universalize this experience, the less toxic it is going to become to disclose. Bob Ray's written about his struggle early in his life, and it hasn't held him back too much.
And he didn't get to be the CEO.
That's true. He got to be the interim.
Sorry, I was just joking.
This is an area that
Bob has been very open and provided a lot of leadership on this subject. It's very
he's been extraordinary. He's also older than David Goldbloom, as Dr. Goldbloom will tell anybody who's listening.
Yes. I was so excited to find somebody older than me.
Yeah, well, they were Rhodes Scholars, and I made the mistake one time of asking if they were in the same class, and David Goldbloom was highly offended, so I'll put that on the record. This is an area we've been in for some time, the workplace mental health business, and having a psychologically safe workplace is not easy, but it is possible. And I think when you hear all that Dr. Goldbloom was talking about in terms of having those conversations, having those leaders step up and speak about their own personal experiences, creates a wave of difference through that organization. I could tell you, though, over the course of the last year, in particular through the pandemic, the number of organizations that have reached out to us to ask us to help them with their workplace has expanded dramatically. We typically served smaller, medium-sized organizations. We're now serving very large organizations who are calling upon us to say, help us out. We're trying to navigate. We have a lot of people struggling. What can we do to support them? So we're very happy, frankly, to be in that business. It is run as a social enterprise. We just feel strongly that that support needs to be available to all Canadians. And I'll just share a personal story of a time that I spent with the late Michael Wilson, who I think we can all agree was a great statesman and very fine public servant and human being, who sadly lost his son to suicide. And it was a family tragedy beyond compare, but he managed to turn that into a devotion to this cause that is unmatched, I think we could argue. And I joined him one day traveling to an event together, and we had a lot of time to talk. And he expressed to me that when his son was hospitalized, that all his son wanted was for his father not to tell anyone that he was in the hospital or that he was mentally unwell. And that was the only thing he was focused on. He just didn't want his employers to know because he didn't think he'd ever get a job again. And it was heartbreaking to hear. I think heartbreaking for his father to tell me and others that was their experience. And I think we just really, really have to move on from that and really talk, as David Goldbloom has, about how common this is and how there's nothing to be ashamed of. And to think that someone was suffering in that way and focused solely on their future career is really, we have to do better than that.
You know, David, a number of years ago, I gave a talk at a bank downtown in Toronto to the wealth management group of a bank. So you can figure these are pretty hard-hitting individuals in wealth management. Now, obviously, for confidentiality reasons, I can't say which bank it was, but the letters O, M, and B are all in the title. And this group, I gave them about a 90-minute workshop on mental health. And at the end, one of the people in the group stood up and said, I just want to say something to this group. I have bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness. And 3 times in the last decade, I've had to take a sick leave when I've been ill. And each time when I came back, not one of you said to me, how are you? What happened? And she said, it would have meant so much to me if you had asked me those simple questions. She said, it wasn't a matter of confidentiality. I knew you all knew I'd been ill, but I would have felt so much more connected had you asked me those simple questions. And she sat down, and then one by one, there were about 40 people in the room, one by one, each of them stood up and said, actually, my brother has schizophrenia. My niece has anorexia nervosa. My mother drank herself to death. It became a personal issue for everyone in that room. And yet, even though they worked together, they had never disclosed to each other. And so in the wake of that, it has become defanged as a threat because it's a common experience. And I have to believe that changes culture.
Okay. One thing, David, I know you have to go and actually help people. So I've got a couple things I really want to cover before we end today. And one of them is Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous people on reserve. And my sister is a mental health counselor, and she spent a number of years doing that on reserve in Saskatchewan. And so I have a little bit of a sense of how epidemic mental illness is in those communities. Seems to be a different nature than what we're talking about for the last half an hour or so. So do you have any special ideas about what we can do? Especially, I mean, I presume, if you talk about things like the pandemic spurring on mental illness among the general population, this residential schools discoveries has got to be triggering a lot of terrible things among Indigenous people right now. What can we be doing?
Well, one of the things that I talked about in my book was focused on youth, including Indigenous youth, and the Access Open Minds initiative, which is part of a revolution in youth mental health spreading across the country, has included a number of Indigenous communities, including the largest Mi'kmaq community in the world in the Eskasoni Reserve on Cape Breton Island, and has been tremendously successful there. And when we think about Indigenous communities, they are disproportionately young in terms of the percentage of population under 25 compared to other non-Indigenous communities. And we also know that the peak risk period for the development of a mental illness is in adolescence and early adulthood. And we know that the suicide rate in Indigenous communities is significantly higher than non-Indigenous communities. So there is a lot of work to be done that I'm A, not an expert in, and B, don't want to trivialize with a pithy solution. All right, because there are huge socioeconomic problems, isolation problems, lack of fundamental resource problems, and the legacy of intergenerational trauma that is quite unique to this population. So, it's a complex problem, which means a complex solution, but there are components that are already proving their value. And integrated youth services, like the initiative that's on in Eskasoni, is a really good example.
My colleagues across the country have been working on these issues for a very long time. There's no doubt in my mind that we have serious capacity problems as it relates to meeting the demand. I'm sure as every other Canadian, instinctively think that the events that we've learned about in the last month or 6 weeks will absolutely galvanize how Canadians feel and turn our attention to really what needs to be done to reckon with our history and to begin to own what has happened in the past in a way that I hope over time we can all heal from. And there's just so much work to be done. We immediately called for implementation of the call to action, particularly in the very short term as it relates to the burial sites that we've all learned about. Just a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done here and really needing much more capacity to do it.
Okay, Camille, let's end on this note. You got a bunch of politicos listening to this podcast. You got a bunch of people that work in politics, work around politics, cover politics. What's the call to action here?
Talking about this issue, demanding action on this issue, talking about the fact that we are...
Get specific. What kind of action? What do we need?
Funding. We need money. We need funding. We need supportive housing across Canada. We need more capacity in the system to meet people across the spectrum, from mild to moderate on through. We are well behind where we should be. We talked about this earlier on. We have other countries that are spending 5% more of their health resources on mental health than we are. And there is no reason that we are behind. There's no logical reason. I have watched issues take hold in politics, David, and you lived through the 90s when people became suddenly focused on eliminating the deficit. Who would have thought that that would be a sexy issue or something that would galvanize people? It is entirely possible to galvanize people to say, we need to be doing better. And I think the pandemic is maybe a good launching point for people to say, you know what? I've always had good mental health. I didn't feel great over the last year. I can see how common that is or how that can happen. And I want to make this better. I want to make this system better for children and youth, where we're seeing inordinately high numbers that are unforgivable. We really have a crisis there. We have never seen the kind, we haven't talked about this in the pod, we have never seen the kind of opioid overdose deaths that we have seen in the course of the last year. We have parts of Ontario where those numbers are far higher than people who were diagnosed with COVID, people that have died from opioid overdose deaths. We absolutely need a strategy to deal with that immediately. But more so when we talk broadly about mental health and addictions, as David Goldbloom has so well articulated, this impacts everybody. It's in our workplaces, it's in our families, it's in our friends. And I just think it's high time that we all decide that this is a social justice issue that we want to see some action on.
Terrific. Well, what a wonderful note to end on. Thank you for that, Camille. David Goldbloom, really interesting book. Everybody working in a provincial government should read that book. There's a million ideas to try and, as you would say, run a pilot project on. For those of you who are listening, Dr. Goldbloom's not so enamored with Canada's tendency to run pilot projects rather than actually roll out something meaningful that will make a difference. But
Correct.
So anyway, lots of great ideas in that book. And Camille, thank you for the work that you're doing. And both of you, thank you for coming on here and sharing. I mean, we could go on. There's so many issues. We didn't even get to talk about opioids. And to be honest, I kind of thought that was almost a discrete subject matter that merits its own separate conversation. Sure. But in any event, this is incredibly timely. It's personal to me. So I'm one of those people that spends every day wondering if I'm happy enough or if I should be happier. And so thank you for talking openly about it with us and for sharing some ideas. And I certainly get the impression that our attitudes about this are changing.
No question.
This
good reason to stay optimistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always optimistic.
Absolutely.
Thank you for this
Thank you both
great
for coming on the
opportunity,
Herle
David.
Burly.
It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to spend time with you, David. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was really great to connect, Camille, and great to meet David. Take care. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So, Herle Burlyites, tried to buy a bicycle lately? Or bike parts? Or a used car? Or a new car? Or furniture? Or anything manufactured overseas that has to come in by container ship? The pandemic might be starting to come to an end here and in the United States, but it's still choking supply chains all over the world. Our massive reliance on foreign-produced goods, especially from Asia, looks mighty fragile, if not ill-advised. President Biden says the problem threatens America's national and economic security. It's probably a safe bet that we're going to start hearing a lot more about the need to shorten supply chains, to rely on manufacturers much closer to home. Count on it, actually. You've heard of offshoring? Well, get used to another term, nearshoring. Our sponsor, CN, is perfectly situated to help. It's already a crucial transportation enabler in North America. Its network stretches from coast to coast in Canada and down through the American heartland to the Gulf of Mexico. And the deal CN has signed to merge with Kansas City's Southern Railroad would vastly increase its reach. The new combined railway will reach 18 states and stretch deep into Mexico to ports on both of that country's coasts. Shorter supply chains are almost certainly the future. North Americas are already entrenched and highly functional, as we have seen in the past year and a half. And CN has been a big part of proving how well they work. We have a new, updated version of NAFTA. We have the ability to increase our self-reliance, but it will take 21st century solutions, like the merger of CN and Kansas City Southern, to carry off the execution. All right then, it's not Tuesday, it's Monday afternoon. For personal reasons, we're recording this pod early, and it may reach you earlier on Tuesday for that reason. But sadly enough, it means we are recording this pod before Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals, which occur tonight, which means we can only chew our nails and bleat about our anxieties here today rather than reveling in the victory. But I'm feeling good.
So David, you told us to wear our jerseys today, and you're not wearing one. So you're going to have to explain why.
Yeah, what gives? We feel that we've been let down. This three-legged stool, and you've sawed off one of the ends.
Well, I get it. I am wearing a Canadiens shirt. I am wearing a Canadiens t-shirt, but not a jersey. And the reason why I'm not wearing a jersey is because I don't have a contemporary player's jersey. I do not have the jersey of a player that is on this team. And as much as I have enjoyed trying to summon the ghosts of Mats Naslund and Claude Lemieux and Peter Mahovlich and Guy Lafleur, that's not who this comes down to anymore. It's the boys on this team. And so I'm wearing team paraphernalia now, not old guys. As near as I can tell, Ken Dryden's in Toronto tonight, not Tampa. So it better be Carey Price that comes through, and it better be Cole Caulfield or Jesperi Kotkaniemi or Nick Suzuki or Jeff Petrie. And if I had any of those jerseys, I'd be wearing it right now.
So basically, you're making Scott look bad because he's wearing his Henri Richard
piss on
jersey.
my parade.
And
Thanks, Dave.
And you're making me look good. So that's fine.
I couldn't disagree with you more. Throughout these playoffs, this improbable team has been supported by the Ghosts. I have personally, wearing Henri Richard, the Pocket Rocket signed jersey, I have been personally and many times basically held seances in the basement of my home, right? Spread leaves and drew pentagrams. I've done everything I can to summon the Ghosts. The Ghosts have taken us this far, and I don't think their spectral power has been exhausted. So I'm sticking with it, and I'm not a bit worried, David, about any kind of jinx. I think it's been the fuel of this postseason success. So go Habs, go, man.
I bet Cole Caulfield doesn't know Jean Beliveau from Jean-Guy Talbot. And that isn't stopping him from potting them every chance he gets. So keep going.
I'm all for these guys. You know what I found in my closet, by the way, the other day? I was looking around for different jerseys. You know what? I discovered a Theodore jersey.
Oh yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't remember that I had that.
You just blew out there. What was that? Holy Christ.
You need to scratch your Yeti or something. Give it a good one.
So you were telling us you found a Theodore sweater.
So I find this old Theodore sweater. I didn't even know I had it. It's covered in dust and tears. I had no idea. So it's back there. I'm gonna.
Don't fucking
like I shouldn't wear it, eh? Like it didn't feel like that would be good karma. So I just left it hanging in that spot.
Although actually, Theodore's in goal, I think, was the last time Eric Stahl was good.
That's not nice, guys.
It was he destroyed us that playoffs. We were cruising against Carolina until Eric Stahl decided that he could score on Theodore at will, and it got ugly.
Theodore won the Vezina, didn't he?
Theodore's an interesting story. You know, the guy won the Hart Trophy.
Yeah, that's right.
The guy was absolutely the best goalie in the world, and then disappeared. Like, just fell off the map like that.
You and I went in that night. Remember? We went into the dressing room, and we sat and chatted with him before we went in and talked to Claude Julien.
Right.
Do you remember that? It obviously made a huge mark on it. It obviously left a...
No, not really. I don't remember it.
He was standing there.
I barely remember Claude Julien.
Speaking with us. Yeah, I remember the Claude Julien. But he spent some time with us also. Well, obviously, you... Because I was struck by how small he was, how thin, how slight, and how we were not.
Scott goes into the dressing room and sizes up the players' bodies. All right.
I mean, that wasn't my intention, but while I was there, I couldn't help but notice many of them were disrobed or partially disrobed. I was thinking to myself,
see, this is why we'll never end up getting
How long has Sailor been away now?
Hockey.
What's that, Jenny?
This is why we'll never get to do commentary for hockey. Because you creep people out, Scott.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe if you're a hockey player, but I think lots of other people are curiosities.
All right, let's get to some hockey. By the way, holy Christ, it's hot right now, eh? Hot? You hot?
Nothing compared to BC. I was talking to a client today. They're closing their restaurants and the schools are shutting down. That's how hot it is in British Columbia right now. And I'm not exaggerating. Like, they're literally shutting down the schools. They're saying it's too hot to keep the schools cool. Go home and sit in your fridge.
Yeah. Speaking of hot, federal politics is hot this week, and we're all about federal politics this week. Doug Ford, taking a week off you. Jason Kenney, you're safe as houses this week from us, right? Legault and your Bill 21, we're not coming at you. We're all federal politics all the time this week. And we'll start with Catherine McKenna, a very senior member of the cabinet, announced today, leaked over the weekend, announced today that she's not running again. And it's not because she wants to retire. In part, it's because she wants to spend more time with her family, but in part, it's because she wants to work hard in the fight against climate change. And she decided that the infrastructure minister of the government of Canada wasn't the place to do that. I think there's a lot that's interesting about this story. Jenni?
Yeah, I think it's a lot that's not being said about this story. The fact that she thinks that she can make a bigger impact on the issues that she cares about by not being part of the Trudeau government, a government that is poised right now to win a massive majority, if you believe the polls, in terms of re-election. So it somewhat says how people in that cabinet, in that party, feel about how they're treated. She's not. She's of a growing list of women within the Trudeau government that obviously don't feel that they are respected in any regard, and have decided to leave politics, or stay in politics like Jody Wilson-Raybould, but just stay, but do it as an independent.
We'll get to her. Scott, what's your take on Catherine?
I don't know that I would generalize it quite as much as Jenni did there, but I think that it is an interesting. I mean, first of all, it isn't like there's 19 cabinet ministers who are saying, you know what, I'd rather go work for the outside in order to affect change. I think it's interesting. First of all, I think she was a really dedicated environment minister, and I think that she really. Mm-hmm. I think that turned out, whether she knew it at the time that she got it or whether that's only become more manifest in retrospect, that was a dream job for her. That was the job of a lifetime. And obviously she's committed to that pocket of issues. And in infrastructure, you do get an opportunity to affect some of that because, you're talking about what you choose to finance and what you don't. Green infrastructure, enormous, prop tech, as they talk about. So there's lots to do. And I think she's done lots there, but it is interesting that her personal political judgment is that she was far away now from the center of action in the government, still in cabinet, but far away enough from the center of decision making in and the cut and thrust of where decisions are being made, that she's like, if I'm not part of that, then I just might as well step out completely. And I think it's probably a balance. She's got kids, and often commented upon she'd become like a real lightning rod of like incel assholes and all sorts of, toxic online abuse. And then maybe when she sort of balanced it out, well, for me personally, if I'm not part of the play, if being at the cabinet table, but not being at the decision-making table, and I still got to take all this shit, maybe it's time to move on. I think that's an interesting statement about where we're at in parliamentary government, cabinet government, where authority lies, because you do have this centralization of power. And it doesn't centralize in the hands of 30 people. It centralizes in the hands of a few.
One thing it makes me think about, if the two of you's theory is correct, and I'll meld them two together and say that, we've been on this increasing trend for decades towards centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office and a handful of advisors around that, and that the Trudeau government seems as strong an exemplar of that as any government has been, that being a cabinet minister, whether you're Jane Philpott or Catherine McKenna, it doesn't appear to be a must-have job. And so, it used to be that being a member of parliament wasn't necessarily a great job, but you had the chance of being a cabinet minister, which was a highly desirable thing to do, and people spent their lives trying to get there. But if people don't desire to be cabinet ministers, we're really going to have trouble recruiting candidates.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I think we know what politics is like. It's what you make it. And so there are a lot of people that come into politics that might have a much different view as to what being an MP or being a cabinet minister is. We've talked about it. People that do seem a bit naive in terms of some of the machinations of politics. And so I'm not saying that Catherine McKenna was that at all. She was, she was a liberal. She was a darling of the Liberal Party. Was very high regarded. Was seen to be part of kind of the in class, for lack of a better term. And she made the decision that that's not, for whatever reason, she doesn't want to stay involved in partisan politics. But I think that like being an MP and being a cabinet minister, it really is, it's what you decide to make it. Like if you see successful politicians in the past, it's what they have decided to make their experience in government, their experience in opposition.
She's so high profile and so accomplished in an area that's very near and dear to the Liberal Party's heart that in most circumstances, a person in her position would have fancied themselves a leadership contender when Mr. Trudeau stepped down. Somebody that would have a real shot at running for leader of the party. Instead, she's foregoing her pension. If she got reelected in this fall, which she would if she ran, she would be immediately eligible for an annual pension of about $40,000 a year. And so she's turning that down. I mean, she really doesn't want to do this anymore.
That's one of the reasons that I think that we have to be cautious about drawing universal conclusions from this example. It feels very individual. I think that her experience has been unique. I think that her perspective is probably pretty unique. I don't know many politicians that aren't looking at that date on the calendar and paying close attention to it and focusing their energies on getting past that date, not walking away before then. So I think there's it's easy to sit and kind of muse about what this tells us about the trend of politics overall or about the character of this particular government. And I'm sure there's insights to be found. But I think ultimately, like, it's got to be a really individualized thing. I think, there is this category. It's kind of what picking up on what Jenni says. There's this category of person that came in 2015. They weren't just new to government. They weren't just new to cabinet. They're new to politics. And so I think there's a percentage of them who are like, well, we're going to get in there and we're going to be revolutionaries, right? We're going to implement a movement. We're going to change that. And then they got there and it was sort of like factory whistle blows. You punch the clock, when you're in cabinet or just caucus. And it's kind of like, I'm not always on the inner circle. I won't always be at the decision-making point. And for some people, it's like, that's cool. Then I'll just work away and I make of it, as Jenni says, what I will. But for other people, they're like, you know what, for me, for what floats my boat, if I'm not at the center of doing that, then I'm going to go be someplace else where even if my decisions aren't as consequential as the ones they're making in that room, I'm at least at the table where those decisions will get made. And so I think it's a kind of a personal kind of what matters to you most issue.
Right.
Well, and I think that also, like, everyone, pensions are always the thing that people like to talk about in terms of whether people are running or not, whether there's going to be an election or not. There's been commentary, well, there's no way Trudeau's going to call an election now because of, and we've talked about this, well, because he's got so many people from the class of 2015 that are. All I'm saying is, I don't think governments care whether the vast majority of their caucus members' pensions are due, and I think that we're seeing with Catherine McKenna that there's a lot of parliamentarians that don't care about that as well.
Apparently, not allowed to raise the question of whether people are interested in their pension or not.
Really?
Based on the exchange between Jody Wilson-Raybould and Carolyn Bennett, which will be our next subject.
I'm not sure that's a lesson you can withdraw from that incident, but okay.
Well, what is the lesson to draw from that incident?
Well, the lesson to draw from it is be careful. Like, if you're thinking of someone's name, don't and you want to text someone about them, don't text them directly.
It's a lifelong lesson that that we've all learned many times. I'll speak just for myself. I've learned it multiple times, painfully, over and over and over again. Obviously, I'm not very good at learning it, which is like, don't fuck up and don't be a fuck up. This was just a flat out fuck up. And so, Carolyn put herself in a position where she was enormously vulnerable because it was a vulgar and stupid thing to say. And she knows that, but she's going to rightly just take her lumps on it. She's going to have to. It's like when I said beer and popcorn and I knew that I had shit the bed. And it's like, it's like the millions of mistakes that people make sometimes. And, some you pay more dear consequence for than others, but that's it. I think that's what this incident was. It was a fuck up.
Yeah. My guess is as soon as she pressed send, she probably realized it. And it was like one of those, like, fuck.
Right. So how does it then become public? It's a personal fuck up, and then all of a sudden it's in the media. How's that?
Well, nothing's personal. If you send a note to someone who's not your friend, then you have to expect that it's going to be public. It's like everything we say or do, we have to expect if we typed it, it's going to end up being public. So it's public because it is what it is. Like I don't think there's any blame I don't blame Jody Wilson-Raybould. It's not like the Liberal Party was good to her in any way. So when we type things, we have to expect that it's going to end up being public.
It's a fuck up with three portions, right? So it's a fuck up. The first portion is thinking it and saying it or doing it, right? The third is then sending it, right, to the wrong person, or sending it at all, but certainly it's compounded when you send it to the wrong person. And then the final portion of the fuck up is you've given it to somebody who is going to make full use of it. And you can't really hold that against the other person. You're the one jamming your stick in their spoke. So don't be surprised if they snap the stick off on you. So, these are the three, the trinity of fuck upness that has been committed here. I know it well.
Well, I think you both don't want to touch the fact that her text was deliberately, provocatively interpreted.
What do you mean?
Well,
no, I know what you mean.
Do you think it was a racist and a sexist text?
No, but I
don't think it was racist or sexist at all. I'm assuming that Carolyn Bennett would say that about anyone that was elected in 2015 and was about to come up to their pension, and because we've all talked the same way. Like, we all talk about decisions. We've worked with politicians and we're like, oh, how many are they going to run again? Or when are they up for their pension? Like, we've all had conversations internally about that. So I don't think it was that at all. I think it was anyone in the class of 2015 is going to be talked about that way in terms of motivation leading into whether there's an election before or after the October 19th date or 21st date.
But its harmfulness is that it leaves her entirely open to that interpretation. And that's not a wild interpretation. That's not even necessarily an unjust interpretation. You could take a very competitive run at saying, well, that's a valid interpretation. It is preying on all these memes and historical grievances. Oh, yeah, Indians just looking around with their hand out, looking to make a buck, trying to draw a pension. I don't for the minute. Now, I've had the benefit of knowing Carolyn for a long time. I'm not going to say I can see into her heart, but I've known her for a long, so I'm not inclined to interpret it that way. But when you fuck up, you leave yourself open to those kinds of interpretations, because by virtue of having fucked up, you're now on the receiving end of it, and you're not in a position where you can squawk and quarrel with those things. So, I think, I don't know, I'm probably going to regret this. I'm probably getting myself into terrible territory, but I think, there's a lot of anger, I think, around that cabinet table and within the Liberal government and the Liberal caucus and party, whether you think that anger is evidence of malfeasance and arrogance on the part of the Liberals, or whether you think it's justified. There's a lot of anger toward Jody Wilson-Raybould, right? There's a lot of view, like, with the implicit allegation there in that pension was your motives are not pure. And you present yourself, Jody, right, as though your motives are pure. And so she's saying politics, personal motives, political motives. And I think there's this anger that throbs around ever since that whole incident where people are saying, well, Jody Wilson-Raybould has been able to present herself as motivated nobly, and she's as political as anybody else, and she knows how she knows the damage that she's doing, and she knows the way in which she's tactically unfolded her cards here, that there's been a measure of calculation in it. And so there's anger about that. And now you can take a step back and go, anger? Who the fuck are these people? How dare they think they treat her that way and then feel like they're justified to be angry? But I think that's I think that's the dynamic, the interpersonal dynamic that Carolyn spoke about, and that Jody Wilson-Raybould said, well, I don't even have an interpersonal relationship with him. I think they're probably both right. I think the interpersonal dynamic to which she's making reference is that tension that's still there. I think that whole incident left a really big scar, and there's a lot of angry Liberals still wandering around in that caucus and that cabinet going, she gets to go on TV and dunk on us and present herself as noble, and that's not fair. And I think that's what's going on. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that's we got a window into that because of a private fuck up. We got a window into how pronounced that resentment is still.
That's really interesting. All right. So every time we talk, every week we talk, the election seems more imminent. I presume that Catherine McKenna's announcement today is in anticipation that there will be an election called this summer. And so we're now at a point where it's conventional wisdom, not three weirdos on a podcast yelling about how you should go, but
only one of them
conventional
thinks he's
wisdom
too good
that
to wear a
there's
sweater because of his belief. Fucker.
But it appears extremely imminent, and God, why wouldn't it be? Let me start by taking you through Greg Lyle. Greg Lyle runs a company called Innovative Research, and he's been doing that for a long time. He's been in that business as long as I've been in it.
You should warn conservatives, David. This is not going to be an easy thing for conservatives to hear.
And Greg's origins are as a conservative pollster.
I know.
For Philman in Manitoba. So it's
I know.
I wouldn't call him partisan. I don't know if he's
really,
partisan now, but yeah, I mean these numbers. What he did is he looked at various seat clusters, did a huge sample, and then looked at various seat clusters and how they are performing relative to previous elections. So, in the base seats in the prairies, start with the best conservative territory. In the base seats in the prairies, where they're in this section for him are 44 seats, which they won in 2011, 2015, 2019. And they look like they're probably going to win them again. But just as an illustration, the Conservatives got 68% of the vote in the 2011 election in those ridings, 60% in 2015, 71% in 2019, and are currently polling at 45%. Right? Versus the Liberals at 26%, the NDP at 18%, and Jenni, to a point you regularly raised with us, other at 7%.
Yep.
So then you go to the best conservative seats outside of the prairies. 37 seats that they won all of them in the last 3 elections.
And so this is a hodgepodge of like geographic BC, Ontario.
That's right. They're all over the place.
Yep.
But there are 37 seats the Conservatives have won every one of in the last 3 elections. And in the last election in 2019, they beat the Liberals in these ridings by 21 points. And according to Lyle, they are currently polling in these ridings 1 point behind the Liberals.
Well, even if this is a fraction of the truth, this is the reason why we talked about last week. Why, if you're the Liberal campaign director, you're the Liberals, you are pounding on the door of the Prime Minister, like begging him to drop the writ as soon as possible. I'd be with those numbers. They're absolutely horrifying. It's if you're looking at if you're the Conservatives looking at seats, you're looking at the Liberals cleaning up in Atlantic Canada again. They were 32 for 32, of course, in 2015. And you're looking at them winning every suburban seat in Ontario, including if you're the campaign director, you'd be worried about your leader seat.
It just looks brutal. I'll give you one last one here. Non-Ontario Conservative Liberal swing ridings. In 2011, Jenni, the Conservatives won 28 of these and the Liberals won 3. In 2019, the Conservatives won 17 of these. The Liberals won 14. And the Liberals are currently leading in these ridings by 16 points.
So we're talking probably about mostly.
They lost them by 5 points.
We're talking about BC and probably like Edmonton seats, if those are the ridings.
Yeah.
Because right now, I'd say there's 3 seats. Right now, I'd say there's 3 seats in Edmonton that the Liberals will probably pick up, which is, if you look at last election results, is stunning. So. No, there are a lot of reasons why the liberals would want to go into an election, and a lot of reasons why I'm stunned that Conservatives don't think we're heading into an election. I talk to Conservative friends who are like, well, there's no way the Liberals will go. And I'm like, why? Well, they could lose seats. And I'm like, in what fucking universe are they losing seats at this point? Like you can't get a better.
It looks like 200.
Yeah.
So
it looks like 200.
Yeah. And I think we all came out of last week as an example in this discussion saying, okay, like if you're the prime minister, hold a press conference, say, look, I've appointed a new governor general, and sorry, I didn't mention this earlier, but we actually held the election and I won. So we're not even having the election. Greg's analysis here. I swept the country. We'll talk to you in 4.5 years. But so that's my view. My view is I would literally, honest to God, like, I'm not sure, like, other than making sure that people have their bags packed and, their favorite podcast downloaded. I just don't know why you wouldn't call this thing tomorrow. I'm not a worry. I can't conjure up a worry about public reaction at this point. I don't think that. Plus, I think, frankly, if, at least half of your electoral strategy is to ask people to thank you for the job that's been done and try to bank the goodwill that's existing. Why wouldn't you want to, that's a soft play. Why not burn up as many days and weeks of that campaign in the midst of summer? So I ask you two then, if that's our general view, run, don't walk to drop this writ. Is there any validity? Because you get I see people from the press gallery writing blogs and columns saying, "Oh my God, the blistering arrogance of it all, and how they'd be so cynical and all this shit." Is there any price to be paid to calling an election and having it actually all happen in the summer? There's this kind of quiet thesis of, well, you have to at least wait until you get past Labor Day. You couldn't have the election date be in the summer. And my view is,
nobody cares.
Say that. Why not have it in the last week of August? Just get
nobody
it.
Cares. Everyone. This is always the conversation about when is there a good time to have an election? Never. Nobody ever. You can always find reasons, and you'll always find people that will say don't have an election, and it will take up about 2 days worth of conversation at the front, and it will all be people, the chattering class in the media, and nobody cares. Absolutely nobody. David, I'm not sure what you think, but I've never found any government, any party, any government has been punished for when they've decided to have an election. Only punished by not calling it at the right time.
There are so many examples of governments that have missed their window to call it. Far, far more than there are examples of people who've been punished for going too early. In fact, I can't really think of an example, because the only example anybody ever gives is David Peterson in 1990, which is quite a long time ago, right? And there have been many early elections since then. Kretschek called one in the middle of Manitoba was underwater. He called an election.
Shut up in dress shoes and threw a couple sandbags and said, "See ya, I've healed that wound." Onto the election polls.
Yeah, and that was after 3 years. There was no need for an election whatsoever. Anyway, so there's no blowback. I mean, the Peterson example is a very complex example. And, the economy was going south. He'd been tied up in Meech Lake discussions, all kinds of crap. I'm not sure that one even works, but it's the only example anybody ever cites. And I know a lot of examples of governments that should have called it, didn't call it, and then that window closed on them. And for a lot of reasons that we've been talking about, that will happen to this again. That will happen this time again if they wait too long. There's a lot of traps in the future for anybody who's in government right now.
100%.
This is maybe the best time to be going. Horgan had it best, and this would be second best probably. And then after this, you're into some trouble, I think.
Agreed.
But what can the other parties do? What can the other parties do to affect this outcome?
Well, I think there's a lot of logistical things they could be doing, which I'm not sure I see on the ground. But the funny thing leading into this is there literally is no ballot question by anyone, and I say this by the opposition parties and government. There is no ballot question. We have no idea what these parties are running on, and there are times there's elections where you can agree. Or you can disagree with what the ballot question is. This one is there is nothing. And so if I'm the NDP or if I'm the Tories, I'm trying to figure out what am I going to be campaigning on? What are my candidates going to be out campaigning on? What is my leader going to be talking about? What is going to be our focus on the debate? And right now, I don't see any, I don't see this, I don't see it at all. I don't see any discipline among the opposition parties in terms of what they plan on going after the Liberals on.
I think
what are the Liberals? What are the Liberals about?
Well, I think this is an issue.
What's their role?
I would be far less concerned if I were the Liberals about calling an election in the summer versus September, and I'd be far more focused on making certain that my campaign doesn't sound like it's a prevent defense that thinks it's playing with a lead, and just sort of says, "Listen, please, I'm going to crisscross the country. I was hoping you could all just give me a big thanks for the job that's been done." I don't think people vote by and large on what has happened. I think they vote by and large about what's going to happen. And I think the Liberals, and I mean, there's plenty of opportunity for them to do this, but I think they need to put a sharp proposition ahead of people, right? You can't trust these other guys with the monumental decisions that are going to be made, right? The Conservatives are all over the place, particularly incoherent on the economy. You just can't trust that. The other guys are far too irresponsible in their imaginations. And so we're going to have to strike the better balance. These are the decisions I'm going to make. But I think that it's got almost nothing to do with the budget now. Like, we're far removed from that. So I think they're going to have to come up with a new narrative and define some of those choices and define them to their liking. Because I haven't seen them make leverage out of the budget, as an example. Like, again, I go back to it. They've not signed a single childcare deal. So don't tell me that it's a key priority for you. I've not seen any evidence of hard work in the past 3 months to show me that it's, I haven't seen you. You can't muscle a deal out of Nova Scotia with all that money in your fist. I just don't know what you're doing. So that to me, that's a big concern. But their problems are better than the Conservatives. I see the NDP could say, look, they're going to try to unwind all these things, and don't trust them and don't let them do it. And I could see the NDP kind of campaigning on the program the Liberals have delivered and say, we will extend it, whereas they will withdraw it. Maybe there's some milk in that cow, but it's, the Conservatives have got to come up with a coherent economic program fast.
Well, but I think that's also that's a benefit the Liberals have right now, is they can campaign on kind of the status quo right now, because the ramifications of what could potentially be having in terms of Canada's economy hasn't fully happened. We're only now starting to talk about the fact that inflation is rising, which we know can affect interest rates and what have you. And I think that if I am the Liberals, I am looking at potentially what could be coming down the pipe economically. And that is part of the reason why I want to have my election day as soon as possible. I would much rather be sitting with a massive majority government having to face the heat of the Canadian public than I would be heading into a campaign.
Yeah. But so sometimes when nobody has a ballot question, one emerges on its own. Or sometimes when the government tries not to have a ballot question, one emerges on its own. I think back to the great free trade election of 1988, and the Mulroney government had no intention of making that election about free trade whatsoever. They had the most bland, innocuous slogan of managing change, and they were just portraying themselves as good economic managers, keeping things ticking over. And That's not the campaign that ultimately the Canadian people wanted, I guess, and we got a campaign and a fight about free trade. I'm wondering if the Liberals try to bland their way through this. Is there something that could become the election issue?
Sure. There's lots of things that could become the election issue. And I'd be really worried about the example I think of is 1997. Now, you might say, well, what kind of a dumb example is that? Because the Liberals won re-election and they won a majority. They damn near didn't. The campaign really was about nothing. And it was kind of a similar circumstance. Looks like the numbers are as good now as they're going to get. They'll probably get worse. Let's go a little bit early and get this thing in the bank. But there was no coherent, there was Red Book Part 2, and it really didn't track. And so, you saw losses in Atlantic Canada. And, if Ontario hadn't held right to the absolute water level, the majority would have been lost. And I think that, you got to be scared of that example if you're a Liberal, because
did you guys actually think you were going to lose that election? Like, I look back, I was my first campaign.
No.
I was door knocking for the Reform Party and having like a blast. And in looking back now, I can actually say it was a I remember going, well, I'm door knocking in Etobicoke North. We've got a real shot at this. Like, not a chance in hell. Like, I was there ever really a time where you guys thought you weren't going to win that campaign?
No, but almost, I would say, 'cause I was in headquarters,
You're asking the right people, because Scott and I were both insiders on this operation, privy to all of the inside thinking campaign. And data.
He's making fun of me. I was pretty involved in the 97 campaign. I was helping to do the ads, and I was at headquarters there. And I think there was, the point is, I was the fucking man. All right. So just back off, Dave. But I think that they were almost shocked on.
You're going to make us talk about Harjit Sajjan next.
People were shocked though on election night. Like when they saw those losses start rolling up. I mean, there were lots of people in the Atlantic, but caucus members are always saying, "Oh my God, I got to be scared." Like these changes, these EI changes, UI changes, UI to EI changes. At that point, they're like, "Oh, they're going to kill us. They're going to kill us." And you kind of go, toughen up. And then they just started going down like fir trees. And you're like, oh, geez. And I don't think that, to your question, I'm not sure. I think people saw softness, Jenni, but it was on election night, I think, when people were more scared than any other time during that campaign. And anyway, the point is that kind of campaign, you could drift into that kind of campaign. And I just think, if you're the Liberals, you've got to put a sharp contrast on the table and say, this is what they will do with this economic recovery and with this balance we have to strike. This is what we will do. But you got to know what you want to do with it. And you got to articulate a little more sharply than these guys are used to articulating these things when it comes to economic policy.
Let me ask you a difficult question. It's difficult for me to ask properly, which is the stuff that's going on now with, for instance, Sir John A. Macdonald, and now with the media and online condemnation of organized religion, but particularly the Catholic Church with respect to the residential schools, the demand for inquiries, which the government seems open to, the demand for criminal justice, which the government seems open to. A number of these things, is this the kind of thing that could become an issue? Is there a silent majority out there that isn't really feeling the wokeness of attacking the Catholic Church, for example? Or is that
I don't think it's an issue. I don't think it's an issue. I don't think it's an issue. Like you're talking like kind of like pro-church as opposed to.
Well, I was partly inspired by Aaron O'Toole, and his "We're going to celebrate Canada Day. We fucking believe in Canada Day. We're not taking Canada Day off. We're proud of it." And so, is there a pro-Canada, pro what the regular person believes about Canada story there that could upset the apple cart?
But I think that's what the average person thinks. I think that the average person I think the average person is proud to be Canadian. I think the vast majority of people, I can't think of anyone who wouldn't be horrified when they hear about what happened in terms of residential schools and the kidnapping of children from their families. I think the average Canadian doesn't. They feel ashamed for what happened, but I don't think it takes fully away of being Canadian. Do I think that it's an election issue one way or another? I don't think that it is, because I think that at the end of the day, it just doesn't affect Canadians. And I think that for the most part, people vote, good or bad. People vote based on what directly affects them.
I'm going to pull your question apart, I think, David, because I think differently about certain beats that you hit in it. I think, although I was on the record in the last election when we would all chat about it, I was also scared then about the People's Party and whether it could catch. I never thought it was going to start winning 5, 6, 7 seats, but I wondered at the beginning of the campaign if it could pick up some momentum and pick up some of that kind of aggrieved politics of resentment kind of voter thing. It didn't, so I was wrong then. Maybe I'll be wrong now, but I think there's in the don't tear down the statues, don't tell me that Canada Day is a day of disgrace and I can't celebrate it. I think there's a cohort of voters out there who feel relatively strongly about that, and I think that you could probably, if you were willing and if you believed in that, you could tap into that and get some votes out of it. And I think that, so I think whether it's Max or it's O'Toole, and it's actually kind of awkward for O'Toole because he wants to present himself as centrist and not getting caught up in kind of culture wars. But on the other hand, he's actually got to fight some of that stuff in order to strike differentiation and to make certain that he keeps Max in a box. I think there's votes to be had there. I say that cynically because that's not necessarily my point of view, but I think there's votes to be had there. I think the antidote to, I think what insulates the federal government, the Liberals, if they're smart on this though, is also woven up in that. I think the Catholic Church thing is different because I think it's impossible for any reasonable person to say that they're cool with what happened with residential schools. Instead, you get people saying, well, look, I obviously hate what happened there, but I don't know that I want to tear down Sir John A's statue or cancel Canada Day. So that's where O'Toole wants to play. I think that the Liberals can come back and go, yeah, and you know what? The Catholic Church has played legal games. They've ducked their responsibility. The United Church did. The Anglicans did. We as the federal government did. There's a lot more to do, but they should be paying up and taking accountability. And I think that you could turn that into a populist issue that insulates you and reframes that whole cancel culture, cancel Canada Day, tear down Sir John A statue thing, and allows you to navigate it. So I actually think in a weird way, a hard line on the Catholic Church, which we've seen Trudeau take a couple times in a couple moments during this thing, I think it could actually be insulation on that debate.
Jenni, you don't see any chance for a Sunny Ways O'Toole campaign about how I love Canada just as it is. And I'm not going to hang dog around all the time like Trudeau and the Liberals do, apologizing for what Canada is.
Well, I don't think we've fully, like, I don't think there's any evidence that that's kind of where Aaron is, where Aaron or the party currently is. We've seen high-profile members of his caucus apologize for different things, and so I don't see, a Sunny Ways campaign is campaigning. I don't see that. I don't see it happening. I don't see that the Conservative Party is currently going to be too controversial in terms of their defense of different things.
Do you think they might leave votes on the table for Max's party as a result? Like, do you think there's more risk of those guys creeping up than there was last time?
Well, I think we've seen that there a risk of other parties creeping up, but I don't think that it has to do with. I don't think it has to do anything with in terms of Sunny Ways or statues. I think that we've seen that we've seen the creeping up of both the Maverick Party and PPC, but I think they're based on how people see there's a segment of the population that don't see any difference between Erin O'Toole and Justin Trudeau, and I think that's why you're seeing the the numbers that the Conservatives have in the prairies, and I think you've seen it from a while. We go back to. People will vote based on what personally affects them. And right now, they personally do not see much of a difference between Erin O'Toole and Justin Trudeau.
Did any of Greg's polling, David, Greg's polling touch on the issue of O'Toole and how he's defined? I can't remember. I only saw some of it online. I don't know if you saw more of it, but
no, not in this particular report.
Sorry?
With this report of Greg's didn't get into that. No. And I mean, I don't suspect that people could tell you very much about him. They have a negative impression on a net basis. Why that is and what that's based on is probably almost nothing. It may be guilt by association as much as it is anything that he has done personally. Because, I mean, you really can't overestimate how little people know about politics and follow politics, and how few people actually will know enough about Erin O'Toole to have any kind of informed judgment on him. So the election, I don't know that there are attitudes about him that are so deeply ingrained that a really strong election performance couldn't turn it around. I don't think that's true. But on the other hand, I mean, we just don't know. To be honest, I was going to say something snarky, but he hasn't been given any opportunity to be a strong performer. This whole COVID period, there's been no opportunities to stand out.
Yeah, but there have been. But that's not fair. That's not fair. He could have actually stood out. He's in some cases chosen not to. There have been politicians that have stood out, and he is just not one of them.
My complaint would be that he's been inconsistent. It's so hard to get notice if you're an opposition leader and so forth. And so I take that the opportunities have been fewer and tougher to come by. But I think if you were trying to pay attention casually to the 4 times he's popped across your radar screen, he arrived as a different shape every time on that screen. It's this lack of coherence that I think is a real challenge.
But that was his choice. He campaigned in the leadership race based on something that he was not.
Hey, Jenni, if he had campaigned on a similar platform to McKay, if he'd positioned himself in essentially the same place as McKay, who would have won?
Who knows?
Like, would Leslyn Lewis have won?
Who knows?
Yeah.
It's whoever gets the most votes out. You know what it's like, David.
Okay. Time for our Hey Yous. Scott, you ready?
Sure. It's not very interesting this week. I'm gonna give the same Hey You I gave like 3 weeks ago, and I mentioned it earlier in this podcast. I'm probably gonna do it again at some point in the relatively near future. My Hey You is to Chrystia Freeland. I was there with Paul Martin and Ken Dryden when they hammered out these childcare agreements. And I listened to people say, oh, you're trying to force choice down our throats and yada, yada, and all this kind of shit. And then I was there when I watched the federal government now under Trudeau say, we're going to put money on the table. We're going to bring people to the table with the power of the great big federal buck. And I still don't understand why there haven't been federal childcare agreements. I raised this issue 3-4 weeks ago, so I'm going to repeat it again. I think we're a handful of weeks, maybe hopefully days, if they're smart, from an election campaign. I don't see why you would want to go into that election wrapping up 1, 2, 3, 4 agreements, at least with some provinces. So I hope they're working on it. So my Hey You is call an election fast, Chrystia Freeland, but get some childcare deals banked before you make that call. Otherwise, wandering around the country and saying it's a core component of your agenda, it's going to feel like bullshit.
There we go. Jenni.
Yeah, so my hey you is actually we already kind of hit on it. My hey you is to all of the opposition parties, and it's time to, you're getting into an election campaign. We've seen the signs. Liberals are deciding to retire, pensioned or not, and the farewell speeches in the House have happened. So it's time for the opposition parties to all come out and talk about what their narrative is. What are they going to be campaigning on in the next election? Because right now they are not giving voters anything compelling in terms of why they would vote against the Liberal Party or why they would vote for their parties.
Excellent. All right. Mine goes out to Azam Ishmael. Azam just named the campaign director for the Liberal Party. I know him well. Great guy. I first really got to know him when he was responsible for getting the provincial Liberal machine ready for the 2014 election. Did a fantastic job of that. And now he takes this over. And all I'm going to say to you is, don't forget television. I know it's all digital now and everybody's in love with social and internet advertising. Don't forget television. We keep talking here about how you need to frame the campaign. Television helps you frame the campaign. Use it early, at least.
Mayor of Easttown.
All right.
Mayor of
That's our
Easttown
show
political hacks. Think about Mayor of Easttown.
Exactly. Get on that show. It's a good one. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. It's fun this week. We'll be back at our regular recording time Tuesday next week with the Canadians, presumably with a stranglehold over the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Stanley Cup Finals. I want to thank our sponsors, TELUS, our presenting sponsor, TELUS and CN. I want to thank the Air Quotes Media team. I want to thank Scott and Jenni, particularly for making the effort every week to show up here and chat about politics with me. Thank you all for listening, and I'd like to thank Cole Caulfield for obvious reasons.
Go Habs, go.